guys, welcome back to my channel. So I'm making a very specific recommendations video. I don't know how well this is going to be received, but I know there's a couple of you who watch my stuff who are in the same line of work as I do or who like the same things. I'm taking it as a general assumption that if you're on my channel, it's fairly likely that you like animals. So I actually tend to read a lot of nonfiction ever since I basically discovered audiobooks. Audiobooks are the way that I go about reading nonfiction, but I have very specific tastes of things that I want to learn about. Otherwise, it feels like I'm reading a textbook. So this is going to be a video about just animal stuff. It's a wide range of like animal-oriented nonfiction books that are fascinating to me that I think some of you guys might appreciate, because I know whenever I've talked about books like this, they get the most comments whenever I mention them in a video. But this is going to be for all of you people who, like me, grew up watching Animal Planet and Discovery Channel and Nat Geo back when those channels were actually just like hours of like wildlife documentary type of shows and not just like 8 hours of like pit bull and parolees and small animal vet stuff, which is fine as an owner of a pit bull and as somebody who works in the veterinary field. Those shows are great, but I just really miss the like Planet Earth type of things. So these are basically going to be book versions of those. So the first book that I want to talk about is probably the one that I'm going to recommend the most, because I feel like it was one that just changed everything. Like, it changed the game, it changed my mindset about a lot of stuff. And that is called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are by Frans de Waal. And Frans de Waal gets blurbed and quoted a lot in other books. So he's a person that knows what he's talking about. And this is fascinating to me. This is basically going to encompass the things that I am super interested in. And had I gone down this career path, this is what I would be studying. It's basically animal behavioral studies and psychology of how animals work. So this book specifically basically opened up the conversation of intelligence, and if we would stop judging the intelligence of other creatures and animals and species based off what we think is intelligent, it's gonna blow your mind how smart everything else is. So it's basically breaking down the concept that we judge things pretty harshly based on what works for us. Because a bird is not going to be able to know how to do basic math equations, but does a bird need to know how to do math in order to be intelligent? No. So it's basically breaking down the stigma that humans need to stop judging everything else in the world based off of what is smart to us, because we need to know technology. This is how we've advanced as creatures and as beings on this planet. These are the things that we use to judge intelligence and cognitive ability. That's not necessarily so in the animal world, because they don't need to know those things in order to like advance their species. It was fascinating to me. It was mind-boggling. He uses so many examples across the entire book of different types of animals, different species, and things that prove how they've learned, prove that their cognitive abilities have been advancing as quickly as ours have, but for completely different things. And if we would get our heads out of our butts and stop thinking that we are the superior creatures on the planet, it might open our minds up to the fact that other animals might potentially be smarter than us, but just in different ways that don't benefit us, but it benefits them. Does that make sense? Okay. This book was game-changing for me. It was fascinating. I highly recommend it. And if you're going to take anything away from this video, that's the one I recommend. Okay, the next one that I want to recommend is kind of in a similar vein, but goes in a different direction, and that is Becoming Wild by Carl Safina. This is a fairly new release, and Carl Safina has been writing a lot in like the animal husbandry world for a long time. This one specifically discusses the concept of culture in groups of animals. And again, it's gonna be mind-blowing to you guys if you haven't read it. But this is basically discussing the concept of how groups of animals, like families or like pods or herds or anything, how the dynamics work among different breeds of animals. And it's fascinating because we basically define culture by locale, norms, like social norms, what we grew up experiencing, and how cultures vary around the world based on all of these different things. So this basically is touching on the culture of animals in the wild. And there are kind of like three main focuses that he uses to pull examples from, and that is them following pods of sperm whale and tracking their language and how the group dynamics work, how the relationships work in families, and how they're very like matriarchal. animal. Like, they use a lot of grandmothering techniques. And he also discusses macaws as a way to kind of prove how aesthetics and language affect animal communities. And he also discusses chimpanzees, which I think is the most relatable, obviously, to us in family dynamics and how societal structures work in the animal world. It gets really into depth about the language of animals, because not only do animals actually have languages, they have accents and they have dialects, as in you can play bird song of the same species of bird, but that just happens to be in a different part of the country for the same species of bird, and they won't recognize it because it's a completely different accent. It's the same thing as we can recognize people who live in New York versus in like the deep south. It's fascinating. Like, this stuff actually exists and we can hear it. Like, we can tell the difference. And it was the same thing with the pod of dolphins. You can play whale song for a certain pod of dolphins and they won't respond, but if you play the same song in their dialect, they'll respond. It was so cool. So if that stuff is interesting to you, definitely pick this one up. The first book kind of talked about intelligence. This one kind of talks about how intelligence plays a role in group settings in nature. It's fascinating. Okay, going in a different direction, I just want to recommend a person in general. She has a lot of books out, and that is Temple Grandin. Temple Grandin is going to play more into the concept of how we affect animals, and Temple Grandin is one of the most fascinating people to ever exist. The two books that I am recommending in this video are Animals in Translation and Thinking in Pictures. These two kind of cover similar things. Long story short, Temple Grandin is high-functioning autistic, and she has basically used her autistic mind to explain to the world how animals see, because an autistic mind thinks very similarly to how other animals perceive the world. And I don't want that to come off as crass, but that's kind of the point that she's making, where how her brain works, specifically her, is very similar to how she has learned that cattle perceive the world. And she has used all of these years of like studying and years of working in the field to benefit the meat market, in order to make like the cattle butchering process less scary, less intimidating to the cattle. Because let's face it, it's a huge part of agriculture and it's a huge part of our role in the world at this point in time. She's basically using her mind to explain to the world how these cows are seeing these meat processing plants and things that are scary to them versus not scary, just because she specifically gets very overstimulated by similar things that are very scary to other animals. It was fascinating. I also really like learning about psychology stuff, so this was a really good blend of both of those things for me, but it was fascinating to see how she approaches the world, and she explains it so coherently and so elegantly, and it changes your view on a lot of stuff in the world. So Animals in Translation is kind of the broadest book that she's written that basically breaks down this entire concept that I've been explaining, and then Thinking in Pictures kind of gets more in depth into her specific life with autism and how she's related it to her career and how she's related it to working with animals, and it's fascinating. She has so many books out. Those are the two that I'm recommending in this video because I think they're the most like attainable and easy to understand, but Temple Grandin is a fascinating human being. Highly recommend following her and checking out everything she's ever done. And the last book that I'm going to recommend, I'm keeping these short because I know that I ramble a lot in these videos, but if you're interested in the veterinary field, anything by James Harriet. I just recently finally got around to this year reading All Creatures Great and Small. I'm working through the next couple books in that kind of ongoing series of his life. And this is, if you're at all interested in the veterinary field, this is the coolest glimpse into like old school veterinary medicine that I think gives a lot of perspective to where modern medicine is now, and I love it. This appealed so much to the farm girl in me because I feel like a lot of large animal vets are this weird mixture of like old school medicine and new world science. And it was just kind of cool to read this book. James Harriet is a pen name for his books. I think his name is James White. But he is a large animal vet in England in like 1940s around then. So it's really showing you like old school, old like countryside veterinary practices. And it's all of these like little glimpses into a day in the life of a large animal vet, because I feel like large animal vet work is so different than small animal, because small animal, you're just staying in a building, in a clinic, and everybody's bringing their pets to you, and you're likely just seeing cats and dogs with the occasional exotic thrown in there. Large animal, you don't know what you're getting into. And I've shadowed large animal vets. I've worked in a lot of barns over the years, and I've met so many large animal vets, and I've met people just like James Harriet. And you basically don't know what you're getting into every single day when you put on your muck boots. You don't know what farm you're driving to. You don't know what type of situation you're walking into and what type of tools are going to be readily available to deal with said situation. Because large animal stuff is just messy and chaotic and dangerous, and it's a rough field to work in. So this gives you a like really intense glimpse into what a lot of the old school horse vets dealt with back in the day, and it was just really cool to see it, because I feel like I still have a couple vets that I work with that just are very old school in their ways, and they do a lot of things manually. They refuse to use new technology and new medicines and stuff, but it works. And there's a reason for it. Like, they have so much field practice. So this is getting a little bit more away from wildlife studies and biodiversity and stuff, and this is getting more into the medicine part of the world. But I figured I would include it and have kind of a broad range of books that I'm talking about. If you guys have recommendations, I've likely already read it. No, I'm just kidding. If you have recommendations, I'm always looking for books similar to these, because everything about the animal world is fascinating to me. I have endless more recommendations for you, but I figured this was a good, short, broad list of the type of things that I like reading when it comes to nonfiction. I have a couple more lists in the works for different recommendation videos for nonfiction books, but again, I am always on the look, so if you have recommendations, leave them down in the comments. If you think this is interesting, let me know. I can keep doing videos like this, and I will see you guys in my next video.